The Dravidian Kushite origin of horseback riding in Eurasia. The ancient Dravidians belonged to the Ma Confederation. They belonged to the Sea group before they migrated from Africa to India. The Ma Confederation was the greatest empire in Africa before ancient Egypt. This empire extended from Cameroon and Chad into much of the Sahara. In Cameroon, Chad, we find haplogroup R1a, which was common among some Dravidians. Tamil, a Dravidian language, is still spoken in Chad, Cameroon. By 3500 BC, the Dravidian and Mandi tribes began to migrate out of Africa. Dr. Menzies was the first archaeologist to argue that some Dravidians landed in Iran and migrated into India and the Indus Valley. These Kushites were the ancestors of the Yamnaya and Caucasus hunter-gatherer culture bearers. They were the people who practiced horseback riding and etc. It was these people who took horseback riding and chariots into ancient Europe. The movement of Kushite people is supported by the spread of black and red ware from Nubia to the Indus Valley and the South Indian megalithic, and the Dravidian substratum in the Prakrit, Puranas, and other languages in Eurasia. Dravidians and Africans had the will. The Dravidians and African languages share similar names for the will. For example, in Gala, we have Makurakura. In the Tulu language, we have Gali and Tagori. In Swahili, we have Guri and Dumu. In Mandi, we have Koli and Kori, Muru, Fi. In Tamil, we have Kal, Ari, Urul, Tikuru. And in Kalunde, we have Gali, Tiguri, and Tigari. It would appear that the Proto-African Dravidian term for will was Ori or Uri, or Go-Uri or Ko-Uri. The Proto-South Dravidian term for will, Tigu-Uri, the linguistic evidence suggested in the Proto-language the speakers of Proto-African Dravidian use either the vowels O or U, or A or I after the consonants to make the words for will. It is also evident that L and R were interchangeable in the construction of the term for will in the Dravido-African languages. It is clear that African people employed chariots in addition to boats to travel long distances in many parts of Africa. The horse period is dated between 2000 and 1200 BC. These dates correspond to the archaeological research. There were two horses common to Africa, a horse introduced to Africa by the Hyksos, and a native small-sized horse common to much of North and West Africa. Most researchers believe the horse was introduced to Africa, Egypt, by 1700 BC. This is an interesting date, and far too late for the introduction of the horse, given the archaeological evidence of horses at Mahdi and Saharan zone. Most of these horses will really be equises in reality. The archaeological evidence of horses in the Sahara at this early date makes it clear that horses were in Africa years before the Hyksos arrived on the continent, and that a horse native to Saharan Africa was already in existence before this time as well. Second, we have Kushite horseback riding at Wuhan in the 4th millennium BC. This shows that while Asians used the horse for chariots, African Dravidians had long recognized that they could ride the horse. As a result, the practice of riding and Saharan horseback riding support a probably much earlier origin than the late horse period, that some people date to around 700 BC, assigned to these inscriptions by some researchers. We also find so many chariots in the inscriptions of the Dravidians. The Dravidians in Tamil Nadu and other parts of India left us many examples of chariots. Some of these chariots are associated with temples, other chariots are associated with the rock art. But what we know is that these Dravidian people took their experience riding horses and making chariots because they had the will with them when they left Africa to settle in India. The cultural traits of the Caucasus hunter-gatherers, CHG, and European farmers, horseback riding, metallurgy, etc., are of Kushite origin, not Indo-European origin. Researchers maintain that the Caucasus hunter-gatherers and early farmers population originated in Levant and Anatolia. This is an important thing to remember, because the Levant and Anatolia were the strongholds of Kushites, not Indo-Europeans. If the Caucasus hunter-gatherers and early farmer population came from the Levant and Anatolia, these people were Kushites. They were Kushites because the people of the Levant and Anatolia said they were Kushites. Some of the things that point to an African origin of the Caucasus hunter-gatherers and early farm populations supported by the following evidences. Number one, the Kushites began to replace the Anu in the Levant and Mesopotamia after the Great Flood, i.e. after 4000 BC. Two, there is archaeological evidence of Kushites migrating into Eurasia from Middle Africa 6,000 years ago. The Kushites were the round-headed cattle herders depicted in Saharan rock art. They belonged to the C group. The C group was primarily composed of Niger-Congo and Dravidian speakers. 3. There is no archaeological evidence for a back migration of Eurasians back into Africa. You cannot say that Eurasians migrated into Africa unless you have archaeological evidence. This archaeological evidence includes pots and other tools, because each culture had their unique pottery styles and tools. Number 4. Cattle domestication may have appeared first in the Near East, but there is no evidence of the first cattle herders in the Middle East. The first evidence of cattle herders is in the Middle African rock art, not the Near East. These Africans took their agro-pastoral traditions from Middle Africa into Eurasia. Number 5. Africans domesticated the horse before the Indo-European people, as evident in the Saharan rock art. 6. Kushites introduced chariot riding and horseback riding to the world. 7. The cordware pottery tradition began in Africa among the Kushites. It did not appear in Europe first. It appeared in Africa, and it was taken to Europe by the Kushite people. The Indo-European people were a bunch of nomads, like in any culture. Number 9. As supported by the so-called Proto-Indo-European terms that are not of Kushite origin. The Indo-European speakers remained isolated in Central Asia until they attacked Kushite centers in Western Europe and Pakistan and India after 1400 BC. Jones et al. Acknowledges, and I quote, "Given their geographical origin, it seems likely that the Caucasus hunter-gatherers and early farmers are descendants of early colonists from Africa, who stopped south of the Caucasus in an area stretching south to the Levant and possibly east towards Central and South Asia. Western hunter-gatherers, on the other hand, are likely descendants of a wave that expanded further into Europe. The separation of these populations in one that stretches back before the Holocene is indicated by local continuity through the late Paleolithic Mesolithic boundary and deep coalescent estimates which date to around the late megalithic and ancient Near East, making them divergent fourth strands of European ancestry that expands the modern human colonization of that continent," I quote. Jones also continued, "The separation between Caucasus hunter-gatherers and both early farmers ended during the early Bronze Age, when a major ancestral component linked the Caucasus hunter-gatherers was carried west by migrating herders from the Eurasian steppes. The foundation group for this seismic change was the Yamnaya, who we estimate to owe half of their ancestry to Caucasus hunter-gatherers." Linked sources. These sources may be linked to the Mao crop culture, which predated Yamnaya and was located further south, closer to the southern Caucasus. Though the Yamnaya, the Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestral strain, contribute to most modern European populations, especially in the northern part of the continent. Jones continued, makes it clear that given their geographical origin, it seems likely that the Caucasus hunter-gatherers and early farmers are descendants of early colonists from Africa. This view is supported by Trent W. Holliday, who tests the hypothesis that modern Africans had dispersed into the Levant from Africa. He noted that tropically adapted hominids would be represented in the archaeological history of the Levant, especially in relation to Kafas Sakul hominids. This research found that the Kafas Sakul hominids 20,000, 10,000 years ago were assigned to the sub-Saharan population, along with the Natufian samples that are dated to as late as 2,000 or 4,000 years ago. Holiday also found African fauna in the area. The identification of these skeletons in the Levant and African fauna makes it clear that these were Africans, not Indo-Europeans. Indo-Europeans appeared in Central Asia. The only problem with the theory of Jones et al. That IE speakers introduced horsemanship to Eurasia and became the earliest rulers of the land where these cultural traits originated is the fact that the Kaska and Hadi, or Hadic speakers who spoke a non-Indo-European language, was called Katili. The gods of the Hadic people were Kashku and Kusu. The Hadic people are related to the Hatyu, one of the Delta Tenuhu tribes. Many archaeologists believe that the Tehanu people were related to the Sigru people. The Hadic language is closely related to African and Dravidian languages. Researchers claim the Caucasus hunter-gatherers and early farmer populations came from Levant and Anatolia. This again points to the important fact that these Anatolians were Hadic speakers. These were black people. The Hurrians spoke a non-Indo-European language. Formerly, linguists suggested the Hurrians were dominated by Indic speakers. Linguists of the Indo-European language found this theory because some of the names for the earliest Indo-Aryan gods, chariots, and horsemanship are found in Hurrian. The names of the Hurrian Sanskrit gods include Mitra, Aruna, or Varuna, Indara, Indra. The only problem is that these are not Indo-European gods. These were gods of the Hurrians, and the Hurrians were not Indo-European speakers. The discovery of these words made researchers believe the Indo-Aryan speakers dominated the Hurrians. These researchers used this finding to support an Anatolian origin for the Indo-European speakers. The theory Hurrian speakers were dominated by Indo-European speakers was held in high regard until Georges Caldehold studied 500 Hurrian names and found that only 5, I repeat, 5, were Indo-Aryan sounding. This made it clear that the Indo-Aryan people probably learned horsemanship from the Hurrians, who were Kushites, and not the other way around. At the base of this site, the language of the Hittites is Hadic. Since this language was used as a lingua franca, Nessa was probably not an Indo-European language assumed by IE linguists. This, along with the fact that the Hittites never defeated the Kaska and the Hurrians introduced horse-drawn chariots and carts, shows that the first horsemen, the first people to ride in chariots in Eurasia, were not Indo-European. The first people to introduce this art of horseback riding were the Dravidian Kushites. The Kushites and Dravidians all came from Africa.